April 22nd, 1934. Inside the breakers, the greatest mansion ever built in America, an 88-year-old woman prepared to die alone. Alice Vanderbilt had spent 35 years fighting to keep this palace. Now, in the depths of the Great Depression, she was losing. The bills were crushing. $83,000 a year in property taxes alone. 58 servants needed just to keep the 70 rooms minimally maintained. The fortune that built this place had evaporated, divided among too many heirs, destroyed by market crashes and careless spending. Outside, Newport's other Gilded Age palaces were being demolished, boarded up, abandoned to decay. The era of American aristocracy was ending, and Alice Vanderbilt was watching it die from inside its greatest monument. The breakers cost $7 million to build in 1895, over $240 million in today's money. It was designed to last forever, built of fireproof stone and steel, filled with platinum and marble and gold. But no one had considered what happens when forever arrives, and no one can afford to maintain it. This was a house that required the wealth of railroad empires to survive. Those empires were gone. Alice faced an impossible question. She could leave the breakers to one of her surviving children, condemning them to the same financial death spiral that was killing her, or she could let it go, watch it be torn down for scrap like so many other Newport mansions, erasing her husband's legacy from the earth. There was no good answer. The house that was built to prove Vanderbilt's supremacy had become a monument to their fall. This is the story of how America's grandest mansion became too expensive for even the Vanderbilts to keep, how a palace built to last centuries nearly died after just 40 years, and how it survived only by being given away. If you enjoy exploring the rise and fall of American dynasties, hit that like button and subscribe. Let's begin with the end. Chapter 1. April 1934. The Widow's Last Days. Alice Gwynne Vanderbilt woke in her oval bedroom on the second floor of the breakers for the last time that spring. She was 88 years old. The room was perfect, designed by Ogden Codman decades earlier, with 4 closets for the 7 costume changes she used to make each day. The pager system that once summoned servants still sat by her bed, though there were barely any servants left to summon. The house required 58 staff to run properly. She was down to a skeleton crew. Outside her windows, the Atlantic crashed against the cliffs. The sound had been constant for 35 years, ever since her husband Cornelius died and left her alone in this palace. She had been 53 years old then, a young widow with money and options. Now she was dying, and the breakers was dying with her. The bills covered her desk downstairs. Property taxes had risen to $83,000 annually. The boilers consumed over 150 tons of coal each year just to keep the pipes from freezing. Insurance, maintenance, minimal staffing. The costs never stopped. Her income had collapsed with the stock market in '29. What remained of the Vanderbilt fortune was divided among so many descendants that her share barely covered the mansion's expenses. She had spent the last 5 years cutting everything that could be cut, alternating years between Newport and New York. So both houses were never open simultaneously. It wasn't enough. The Great Depression had devastated everyone, but it was killing the Gilded Age palaces first. Down Bellevue Avenue, mansion after mansion stood empty. Some had been sold for demolition, their marble fireplaces ripped out, their grand staircases torn apart for salvage. Others were simply abandoned, windows broken, roofs caving in. The aristocracy that built Newport was gone. Their children and grandchildren couldn't afford to maintain what their parents had built to prove their supremacy. Alice had 3 surviving children. Her oldest son, Cornelius III, had been disinherited by his father decades ago for marrying without permission. He had no interest in the breakers. Her daughter, Gertrude Vanderbilt. Whitney was a successful sculptor and museum founder, but she had her own properties and no desire for another, that left Gladys, her youngest, married to a Hungarian count. Gladys loved the breakers. She had always loved it. But could Alice really condemn her youngest daughter to this financial nightmare? The house was worth millions in theory. In practice, it was worthless. Who could afford to buy a 70-room palace that cost more each year than most people earned in a lifetime? Who would want to? The age of private palaces was over. The income tax had made them impossible. The Depression had made them obscene. Keeping the breakers open was like maintaining a cathedral with a congregation of one. Alice had already lost so much. Her eldest son William had died of typhoid at Yale in 1892, before the breakers was even built. Her son Alfred had drowned when the Lusitania sank in 1915, giving his life jacket to a woman with a baby. Her youngest son Reginald had drunk himself to death in 1925, leaving behind 2 young daughters, one of whom was little Gloria Vanderbilt. Alice had buried 4 of her 7 children. She had worn black for the last 9 years, mourning Reginald. Now she was preparing to leave the last great symbol of her husband's legacy to an uncertain fate. The decision wasn't really about the house. It was about what the house represented. Cornelius had built the breakers to establish the Vanderbilt family as American royalty. He had commissioned the greatest architect of the age, Richard Morris Hunt, to create an Italian Renaissance palace on the cliffs of Newport. He had spent $7 million, more than anyone had ever spent on a private home in America. The result was perfection. 70 rooms of marble and platinum, crystal and gold, a great hall that soared 50 feet high, a music room built in France and shipped across the Atlantic in pieces, bedrooms with saltwater bathtubs fed by rooftop cisterns, every detail calculated to overwhelm, to impress, to establish dominance. But Cornelius had only enjoyed it for 1 year. In 1896, a stroke had paralyzed him partially. 3 years later, he was dead. At 55, Alice had maintained his palace alone for 35 years, hosting the parties, managing the staff, paying the impossible bills. She had done it out of love and duty and stubborn pride. Now she was out of money and out of time. The breakers would go to Gladys. That much was certain. Gladys was the only one who wanted it, the only one who understood what it meant. But Alice knew what she was doing. She was passing the burden to her daughter, sentencing Gladys to the same financial struggle, the same impossible choice. Keep the palace and go broke, or let it go and erase the family legacy. There was no good answer. The Vanderbilts had built monuments that required Vanderbilt fortunes to survive. Those fortunes were gone, spent by her late husband's siblings on yachts and estates and European titles, divided among dozens of heirs until each share was insufficient. Alice Vanderbilt died on April 22, 1934, at her townhouse in Manhattan. The breakers sat empty that summer, waiting to learn its fate. The greatest private home in America had become an impossible inheritance. The question wasn't whether the Vanderbilts would abandon it. The question was how long they could afford not to. Chapter 2, November 1892, The Fire That Changed Everything. The first breakers burned on a cold November night in 1892. The Vanderbilt family had come to Newport for the Christmas season, closing out another summer in their wooden Queen Anne cottage by the sea. Cornelius Vanderbilt II had purchased the property 7 years earlier for $450,000, the largest real estate transaction in Newport history at the time. It was a comfortable retreat, nothing excessive, designed by the architectural firm Peabody and Stearns for a tobacco merchant named Pierre Lorillard. Cornelius had been content with it. The fire started in the kitchen. It was late November, the 25th, and the staff was preparing the house for the family's extended stay. Someone later claimed it began with the stove, though the exact cause was never determined with certainty. What mattered was the result. The entire structure was timber and shingle, built in the Queen Anne style that dominated Newport in the 1870s and 80s. Once the flames reached the walls, there was no stopping them. Cornelius watched his summer home burn. He stood outside with his wife Alice and their daughters Gertrude and Gladys, helpless as the blaze consumed room after room. The Newport Fire Brigade arrived with their horse-drawn equipment, but wooden structures burned fast. By the time they had their hoses connected, the interior was already gone. The firefighters focused on preventing the flames from spreading to neighboring estates, letting the Vanderbilt cottage collapse into itself. The heat was intense enough that even the safes glowed red. Cornelius had 2 of them, containing Alice's jewelry and important documents. When workers finally recovered them the next morning, they found the contents largely intact. The steel had held, though barely. Everything else was ash and charred remains. The grand staircase, the elaborate woodwork, the furnishings shipped from Europe, gone in a few hours. The property had been insured for $125,000. The furniture carried another $75,000 in coverage. The boiler was separately insured for $10,000. In total, Cornelius could claim $210,000, though the actual value was certainly higher. Insurance never covered replacement cost for estates like this. But money wasn't the issue. Cornelius Vanderbilt was worth over $70 million, having inherited the bulk of his father's railroad fortune in 1885. He could rebuild a dozen houses without noticing the expense. The question was whether he wanted to. Newport had been a summer escape, nothing more. The family spent most of their time at the massive mansion Cornelius owned on Fifth Avenue in New York, the largest private residence ever built in Manhattan. That residence consumed most of his attention and money. The Breakers was supposed to be simple, a place to rest by the ocean. Now it was a smoking ruin, and Cornelius had a choice. Walk away and summer somewhere else, or rebuild on the same lot where disaster had taken everything. He chose to rebuild, but this time there would be nothing simple about it. Cornelius Vanderbilt had watched his summer retreat burn because it was made of wood. The new structure would be fireproof, not fire-resistant, not carefully designed to minimize risk. Actually fireproof. Stone and steel and marble. No timber framing at all. He would commission a palace that couldn't burn no matter how hot the flames got. And he would do it in 2 years. The decision marked a turning point. The original Breakers had been comfortable and appropriate, a wealthy man's retreat that didn't offend social sensibilities. What Cornelius planned to build in its place would be something entirely different. His younger brother William and his wife Alva had recently completed Marble House, a palace down Bellevue Avenue that reportedly cost $11 million and stunned Newport society with its excess. Cornelius had been content to let them have the spotlight. That was over. If he was rebuilding, he would build the greatest estate Newport had ever seen. The fire had destroyed more than a cottage. It had destroyed Cornelius's restraint. Within weeks, he contacted Richard Morris Hunt, the architect who had designed Marble House and the massive Fifth Avenue residence the family occupied in winter. Hunt was 65 years old, at the peak of his career. The man who had brought Beaux-Arts architecture to America. If anyone could design an impossible fireproof palace in 2 years, it was Hunt. The lot sat empty through the winter of 1892 and into early 1893. Workers cleared the debris, hauled away the charred remains, prepared the ground for something unprecedented. Cornelius had given Hunt an assignment that bordered on fantasy: design an Italian Renaissance palace, make it fireproof. Complete it in time for the summer season of 1895. Spare no expense. The result would either be Hunt's masterpiece or his most spectacular failure. On the cliffs where the original cottage had stood, something new was about to rise. The Vanderbilts were done with restraint. They were done with simple summer retreats. If they were going to maintain a presence in Newport, it would be a presence that no one could ignore, built of materials that would outlast empires. The fire had been a disaster. What came next would be a statement. Chapter 3. The Favorite Grandson's Burden. Cornelius Vanderbilt II was born on November 27, 1843, on Staten Island. He entered a world that would be defined by his grandfather's will and his father's fortune. The Commodore, old Cornelius Vanderbilt, was already building the steamship and railroad empire that would make the family name synonymous with American wealth. But the Commodore believed in working for what you got. Being born a Vanderbilt meant nothing if you didn't prove yourself. Young Cornelius proved himself early. At 16, he took a clerk position at the Shoe and Leather Bank in New York City. He didn't need the job, his family was already wealthy. But his grandfather watched approvingly as the boy showed up every day, learned banking, mastered the details of finance and accounting. The Commodore had no patience for idle rich children. He wanted heirs who understood how empires were built and maintained. Cornelius understood. When the Commodore died in 1877, he left an estate worth over $100 million. Almost all of it went to Cornelius's father, William Henry Vanderbilt. The other children received $500,000 each, but Cornelius, the favorite grandson, received $5 million outright. It was a fortune by any measure, more than most men could earn in 10 lifetimes. For the Commodore, it was a test. Let's see what the boy does with real money. Cornelius didn't waste it. He invested carefully, managed his inheritance with the same discipline he'd learned at the bank. His grandfather had been right to trust him, but the real inheritance was still coming. In 1885, William Henry Vanderbilt died suddenly of a stroke. He had doubled the family fortune in just 8 years, turning $100 million into $200 million through careful railroad management. The bulk of that massive estate went to his eldest son. At 42 years old, Cornelius Vanderbilt II inherited approximately $70 million and control of the New York Central Railroad system. The weight was crushing. Cornelius wasn't interested in being a public figure. He had married Alice Claypool Gwynn in 1867 after meeting her at Sunday school, where both taught children about scripture and morality. They had built a quiet life focused on family and charity work. Cornelius gave generously to the YMCA, the Red Cross, the Salvation Army. He endowed buildings at Yale after his eldest son William died of typhoid there in 1892. He believed wealth carried responsibility, but he preferred to exercise that responsibility privately. Now he was the head of the Vanderbilt family, chairman and president of the New York Central Railroad and 49 related railway systems. The financial press watched his every move. Labor disputes, rate negotiations, government regulations, all landed on his desk. His younger brothers could spend freely, build pleasure palaces, race yachts, marry European aristocrats. Cornelius had to manage the empire that paid for their extravagance. Friends later remarked that Cornelius never seemed happy. He carried the burden of being the responsible son, the one who inherited not just money but obligation. While his brother William Kissam built Marble House for his socially ambitious wife Alva, Cornelius worked. While his youngest brother George commissioned Biltmore Estate in North Carolina, spending $5 million on a private chateau in the mountains, Cornelius managed the railroads that made such projects possible. He understood that the family fortune required constant attention. His grandfather had built it through obsessive focus. His father had doubled it through careful management. Cornelius's job was to preserve it while his siblings spent it. The stress manifested physically. Cornelius developed a reputation as a workaholic, spending long hours at his office on railroad business. He was meticulous, some said obsessive, about details. Every decision had to be analyzed, every risk assessed. The fortune he managed supported not just his immediate family, but dozens of relatives who depended on the dividends from railroad stocks. One mistake, one poor investment, could damage them all. His marriage to Alice produced 7 children. The first, a daughter named Alice, died of illness in 1874 at age 5. William, the eldest son, died of typhoid at Yale in 1892 at 21. Those losses marked Cornelius deeply. He threw himself into philanthropic work, donated Vanderbilt Hall to Yale in William's memory, tried to find meaning in tragedy through generosity, but the pain remained. The New York mansion Cornelius built on Fifth Avenue reflected both his wealth and his sense of duty. Designed by architect George Post and later expanded by Richard Morris Hunt, it was the largest private home in Manhattan, covering an entire city block. Over 130 rooms filled with art, elaborate woodwork, space for enormous dinner parties and charity events. The house wasn't just a residence. It was a statement that the Vanderbilts had arrived as American aristocracy, that they belonged among the old money families of New York society. But Cornelius found little joy in it. The mansion required constant upkeep, employed dozens of servants, cost a fortune to heat in winter. It was necessary for his position, expected of someone managing the Vanderbilt interests. So he maintained it, hosted the required dinners, played his role, and escaped to Newport each summer, where the original breakers offered something closer to peace. When that cottage burned in November of 1892, Cornelius was 59 years old. He had managed the railroad empire for 7 years. He had buried 2 children. He had spent decades being the responsible Vanderbilt, the one who worked while others played. The decision to rebuild the breakers as a fireproof palace wasn't about showing off. It was about creating something that would last, something that couldn't be destroyed by accident or carelessness. After a lifetime of maintaining what others had built, Cornelius Vanderbilt wanted to build something permanent himself. He would get 2 years to enjoy it. Then his body would betray him, just as it had betrayed his father. The burden of being the responsible son, of managing an empire while others spent freely, would prove too heavy. But he didn't know that yet. In late 1892, standing on the ruins of his summer cottage, Cornelius Vanderbilt believed he had time. He was wrong. Chapter 4. 2 years to build the impossible. Richard Morris Hunt received the commission in late 1892, within weeks of the fire. At 65, he was America's preeminent architect, the man who had brought European grandeur to the New World. He had studied at the École des Beaux-Arts in Paris, the first American to do so, and spent his career translating that classical training into buildings that announced their owner's arrival among the elite. The Vanderbilts were his favorite clients. He had already designed their Fifth Avenue palaces, Marble House in Newport, Biltmore Estate in North Carolina. Now Cornelius wanted something that would surpass them all. The assignment was absurd. Design a 70-room Italian Renaissance palace. Make every structural element fireproof. No wood anywhere in the frame. Complete it in 2 years so the family could occupy it for the summer season of 1895. Most projects of this scale took 5 years. Minimum Hunt had 2. And Cornelius wasn't interested in excuses. The railroad baron had watched one house burn to ash. The replacement would be built of materials that could withstand anything. Hunt produced preliminary drawings within 6 weeks. He drew inspiration from 16th-century palazzos in Genoa and Turin, studying the work of Italian Renaissance masters. The structure would be steel-reinforced masonry faced with Indiana limestone. Not a single wooden beam in the frame. Even the roof trusses would be steel. The boilers, those dangerous fire hazards, would be housed in an underground chamber beneath the front lawn, separated entirely from the main building. If they exploded, the house would survive. The plans called for a central courtyard concept, typical of Italian palaces, but adapted for Newport's climate. Instead of an open-air courtyard, Hunt created the Great Hall, a massive interior space that would rise nearly 50 feet high with a ceiling painted to resemble the sky. Surrounding this central hall would be the reception rooms, dining room, library, music room, morning room, billiard room. The second floor would house the family bedrooms. The third floor would contain additional guest rooms. The fourth floor, tucked under the roof, would hold 33 servants' rooms. Construction began in the spring of 1893. The foundation alone required months of work. Workers excavated deep into the rocky cliff, creating a base that could support the enormous weight of stone and steel. The limestone came from Indiana, quarried in massive blocks, and shipped by rail to Newport. Italian stonemasons were brought over to do the detailed carving, craftsmen who understood how to work marble and granite into the elaborate decorative elements Hunt's vision required. The scale was staggering. The footprint of the building covered approximately 1 acre, over 43,000 square feet of ground. The total interior space would exceed 125,000 square feet across 5 floors. To complete this in 2 years required shifts working around the clock. During peak construction, reportedly up to 2,000 workers labored on the site, some during the day, others through the night under artificial light. The sound of hammering and sawing never stopped. Hunt had commissioned rooms in Paris to be built by French craftsmen, then disassembled and shipped across the Atlantic. The music room was constructed entirely in France by the firm of Allard and Sons, every panel and molding created in their workshops, then carefully numbered and packed for transport. When the pieces arrived in Newport, French artisans reassembled them inside the steel frame Hunt had prepared. The room came together like an elaborate puzzle, each piece fitting exactly where the specifications indicated. The cost mounted steadily. Cornelius had budgeted $7 million for the project, an astronomical sum. The finest materials in the world were shipped to Newport marble from Italy and Africa, rare woods from around the globe, crystal from Baccarat in France for the chandeliers, bronze and gilt for decorative elements, elaborate mosaics hand-set by European craftsmen. The morning room alone featured walls covered in embossed leather, platinum leaf instead of gold, because Alice preferred its subtle sheen. By 1894, the exterior walls were rising. The limestone facade took shape, massive blocks fitted together with precision, the Renaissance details carved on-site by Italian masters. The arched windows, the classical columns, the carved cornices, all emerged from the stone as Hunt's drawings became three-dimensional reality. Neighbors watched in astonishment as the palace grew on the cliff. Nothing in Newport had ever approached this scale. Marble House had been impressive. The breakers would be overwhelming. Hunt pushed himself relentlessly to meet the deadline. He was approaching 70 now, traveling constantly between his New York office and the Newport construction site. The details consumed him. Every door handle, every light fixture, every square foot of ceiling required his approval. He had created palaces before, but never under such time pressure, never with such absolute demands for perfection and permanence. The interior progressed through 1895. Plasterers created elaborate ceiling work. Workers installed the massive fireplaces, carved from rare marbles, each one a work of art. The grand staircase took shape, sweeping up from the great hall with carved balustrades and elaborate newel posts. Electricians ran wiring for the modern lighting system, though gas fixtures were included as backup. Plumbers installed the innovative system that would feed both fresh water and heated seawater to the bathrooms on upper floors, pumped from the ocean and stored in rooftop cisterns. In the summer of 1895, the family moved in. The house wasn't quite finished. Workers were still completing details in some rooms, final touches on decorative elements, adjustments to the mechanical systems, but the structure was sound. The main rooms were complete, and Cornelius Vanderbilt had his fireproof palace. It had taken 2 years and 3 months from the start of construction. Hunt had delivered the impossible. The architect never saw the building truly completed. Richard Morris Hunt died in Newport on July 31, 1895, still supervising the final touches on his masterpiece. He was 67 years old. The breakers would be his last major commission, the culmination of a career spent creating monuments for America's new aristocracy. He had given Cornelius exactly what was requested, a palace that would outlast empires, built of materials that could never burn. The final cost reportedly exceeded $7 million, equivalent to over $240 million in today's currency. It was the most expensive private residence ever built in America to that point, and Cornelius had gotten what he paid for. The breakers was fireproof, permanent, overwhelming. It announced to Newport and to the world that the Vanderbilts had arrived at the pinnacle of American society. No family could match this display of wealth and power. The palace on the cliff would stand forever, or so they believed. What none of them understood in 1895 was that forever had a price tag, and that price would rise every year. The fortune that built the breakers seemed infinite. It wasn't. Chapter 5. 70 Rooms of Gilded Age Excess. The great hall stood at the center of everything. Visitors entered from the main doors and found themselves in a space that soared nearly 50 feet to a painted ceiling designed to mimic an Italian sky. Massive columns rose along the walls, alternating between engaged and freestanding, their capitals gilded and elaborate. The floor was polished marble, a sweeping staircase curved upward, its balustrades carved from rare stone, leading to the second-floor gallery that overlooked the entire space. This was the heart of the Breakers, the room designed to overwhelm anyone who entered. Hunt had studied the great palaces of Renaissance Italy and understood their purpose. The central hall wasn't just an entrance, it was a statement. In the 16th century, Italian nobles used these spaces to display power and wealth to visitors who might be allies or rivals. The Vanderbilts were doing the same thing in Newport. Every detail of the Great Hall announced that this family had reached the absolute pinnacle of American society. The ceiling alone, painted with billowing clouds and blue sky, created the illusion of being outdoors while remaining completely protected from the elements. To the right of the Great Hall lay the music room, and here the excess reached levels that bordered on absurd. The entire room had been constructed in France by Allard and Sons, shipped across the Atlantic in pieces, and reassembled inside the breakers. The walls weren't covered in gold leaf, as many assumed. They were covered in platinum. Alice Vanderbilt had specified platinum because she found its subtle sheen more elegant than gold's brassy shine. The cost was astronomical. Platinum was rarer and more expensive than gold, but that was exactly the point. The music room served as the primary entertainment space for the house. During Newport's summer season, the Vanderbilts hosted recitals, dances, and formal receptions here. The room could accommodate over 100 guests comfortably. Musicians would perform on a raised platform, while society figures mingled beneath the platinum walls and ornate ceiling. The furniture was French, the chandeliers were baccarat crystal, the floor was polished to mirror brightness. When the doors to the Great Hall were opened, the two spaces flowed together, creating one enormous area for entertaining. The dining room stood on the opposite side of the Great Hall. It was 58 feet long and rose 2 full stories high. 12 columns of alabaster surrounded the space. Each topped with gilded bronze capitals in the Corinthian style, the table could seat 34 guests for formal dinners. Above them hung 2 massive chandeliers, each comprising thousands of crystal pieces, designed by Hunt himself and executed by Baccarat. The ceiling was coffered and painted, the walls featured elaborate carved panels, and at one end stood a fireplace large enough to walk into, carved from gray marble with a hood of Cipollino marble. The morning room was Alice's personal domain. Here she managed the household, wrote correspondence, received close friends for informal conversation. The walls were covered in embossed Spanish leather, stamped with gold patterns. The fireplace was relatively modest compared to others in the house, but it featured a carved mantel brought from a 16th century French chateau. The furniture was lighter, more delicate than the heavy formal pieces elsewhere. This was one of the few rooms in the breakers that felt designed for actual living rather than impressing visitors. The billiard room reflected Cornelius's tastes. The walls were panels of green marble, the ceiling was elaborately carved and gilded, and the floor featured intricate mosaics hand-set by Italian craftsmen. The billiard table itself was massive, regulation size, with carved legs and leather pockets. Interestingly, Cornelius didn't allow smoking in this room, despite billiards and cigars typically going together. He found tobacco smoke unpleasant and banned it from his billiard room entirely. His friends had to step outside if they wanted to smoke. The library was perhaps the most beautiful room in the house. The walls were paneled in Circassian walnut cut in Europe and impressed with gold leaf in patterns resembling leather-bound books. Between the wood paneling and the coffered ceiling ran bands of green Spanish leather embossed with gold. The fireplace had been taken from a 16th century chateau at Arnay-le-Duc in Burgundy, and it bore an inscription in French. "I laugh at great wealth and never miss it, nothing but wisdom matters in the end." The irony of that message appearing in a $7 million palace apparently escaped everyone involved. The second floor housed the family bedrooms, each designed with elaborate attention to detail. Alice's bedroom was a perfect oval, with 4 closets to accommodate the 7 costume changes she made each day during the social season. Her room connected to multiple other bedrooms through discreetly placed doors, allowing her to move between spaces without being seen. A paging system let her summon servants from anywhere in the house. Hidden corridors permitted female servants to maintain the family's clothing and bring fresh linens without ever being noticed by the family or their guests. Cornelius's bedroom was smaller and more austere, furnished in carved walnut with a Louis XIV style. He preferred to spend time at his railroad offices in New York, and typically only came to Newport on weekends during the summer. The room reflected his practical nature. A mantel of rouge royal marble held a large mirror to bring more light into the space. Family photographs and mementos covered the surfaces. This was one of the few rooms in the Breakers that felt personal, rather than performative. The bathrooms throughout the house featured an innovation that impressed even the most jaded visitors. Each bathroom had 4 faucets, instead of the usual 2 fresh hot water, fresh cold water, heated seawater, and cold seawater. The seawater was pumped directly from the ocean into rooftop cisterns, then fed by gravity to the bathrooms. Saltwater baths were considered therapeutic at the time, and the Vanderbilts could indulge without ever leaving the house. Alice's bathroom featured a bathtub carved from a single piece of marble weighing over a ton. Getting it into the house and up to the second floor had required elaborate engineering. The third floor contained additional guest bedrooms, each decorated in period styles ranging from Louis XV to Renaissance Revival. The fourth floor, hidden under the mansard roof, housed 33 servants' rooms. These were far simpler than the family quarters, but they were still better than most servants lived elsewhere. Each room had a window, a bed, a dresser, adequate heating. The servants who maintained the Breakers lived in the house they served, always on call, always ready to respond when the paging system chimed. The final cost of furnishing and decorating the Breakers brought the total expenditure to over $7 million. Cornelius had gotten what he paid for. Every room was a masterpiece of craftsmanship and design. The finest materials from around the world had been assembled into a palace that rivaled anything Europe could offer. The Breakers proved that American wealth could match old-world aristocracy in taste and grandeur. But it also proved something else, though no one acknowledged it at the time. It proved that excess has no natural limit. Once you start covering walls in platinum instead of gold, where do you stop? The Vanderbilts had answered that question. You don't stop. You keep going until you've created something so overwhelming that no one can possibly match it. They had succeeded. The cost of that success would come due later. Chapter 6. A summer house empty for 44 weeks. The Breakers was occupied 8 weeks each year. That was it. The Vanderbilt family arrived in Newport in early June and departed by the end of August. From September through May, the palace sat empty except for a skeleton crew of caretakers who kept the pipes from freezing and the structure from deteriorating. 70 rooms remained silent. The great hall echoed with nothing. The platinum walls of the music room reflected no guests. The dining room table, capable of seating 34, served no one. This wasn't unusual for Newport. All the great summer cottages followed the same pattern. The season was brief and intense, a concentrated period of parties and regattas and social competition that burned through enormous amounts of money in a few short months. Then everyone left. They returned to New York, to Boston, to Philadelphia, back to the cities where their businesses and banks and railroad offices required attention. Newport became a ghost town every September, its mansions shuttered and silent until the following June. But the cost didn't stop when the family left. Property taxes were assessed on the full value of the estate, whether anyone lived there or not. By the 1920s, the Breakers carried an annual tax bill of $83,000. Insurance added tens of thousands more. The heating system had to be maintained year-round to prevent damage from freezing. The boilers in their underground chamber consumed over 150 tons of coal annually. Most of it burned during the off-season just to keep the house from being destroyed by winter. The grounds required year-round maintenance. Trees needed trimming. Paths needed clearing. The elaborate gardens demanded constant care, or they would return to wilderness. When the family was in residence, the breakers required 58 servants to operate properly. 33 lived in the fourth-floor rooms, always on call. Another 25 worked outdoors, maintaining the 13-acre grounds, managing the stables, handling deliveries, and grounds maintenance. During the 8 weeks of occupancy, the house ran like a small hotel. Meals were prepared in the massive kitchen, served in the dining room on scheduled bedrooms, were cleaned daily, fresh linens provided, clothing maintained and pressed. The ballroom hosted events, the music room filled with guests. The morning room saw Alice managing her social calendar. Then September arrived and almost everyone was dismissed. A caretaker couple remained year-round, living in the mansion and watching over it like guardians of an empty temple. They walked through the 70 rooms periodically, checking for leaks or damage, ensuring everything remained secure. Dust covers were draped over the furniture, windows were shuttered. The house went dormant, waiting for June. The waste was intentional. That was the critical thing to understand about the breakers and all the other Newport palaces. The point wasn't efficiency or practicality. The point was demonstrating that you could afford to maintain a $7 million palace that you only used 2 months a year. Cornelius Vanderbilt could spend hundreds of thousands annually on a house he barely occupied because he was Cornelius Vanderbilt. Lesser families couldn't. That was the entire purpose. The Gilded Age aristocracy measured status by waste. Anyone with a few $1,000,000 could build a nice house. Only the truly wealthy could build something magnificent and leave it empty most of the year. The more impractical your display, the more clearly it proved your superiority. The breakers sitting vacant for 44 weeks annually was a more powerful statement than if the family had lived there year-round. It showed that occupying the house was optional, that the Vanderbilts had so many residences and so much money that they could treat a palace like a vacation cabin. This philosophy worked fine as long as the fortune held. Cornelius had inherited $70 million in 1885. That kind of wealth generated enormous passive income through railroad dividends and investments, even spending lavishly on multiple mansions, maintaining staffs, hosting parties. He couldn't exhaust the principle. The money kept growing faster than he could spend it. The same was true for his brothers. William Kissam Vanderbilt had built Marble House and barely noticed the $11 million expense George Vanderbilt was constructing Biltmore Estate, pouring $5 million into a private chateau. The family fortune seemed infinite, but fortunes don't stay concentrated forever. William Henry Vanderbilt, the father who built the $200 million empire, left it divided among his children. Cornelius got the largest share, but his brothers received massive inheritances too. When each of them died, their estates were further divided among their children. Every generation diluted the fortune a little more, and every generation spent more freely than the one before, building bigger houses, buying yachts, marrying European aristocrats who expected lavish lifestyles. By the 1920s, the arithmetic was turning ugly. The Vanderbilt fortune had been divided among so many heirs that individual shares no longer generated enough income to maintain Gilded Age palaces. The mansions required fortunes to operate. The heirs had inheritances, which sounds similar but isn't the same thing at all. An inheritance can be spent down, a fortune regenerates itself. The difference between the two becomes painfully clear when you're trying to pay $83,000 a year in taxes on a house you use 8 weeks annually. Alice Vanderbilt watched this reality close in slowly over 35 years. When Cornelius died in 1899, she was a wealthy widow with ample resources. The railroad dividends kept coming. The investments kept paying. She could maintain the breakers and the New York mansion simultaneously without serious strain. But year by year, the costs rose while the fortune shrank. Property taxes increased. Labor costs went up. The expenses that seemed trivial in the 1890s became burdensome in the 1910s and crushing by the 1920s. She adapted as best she could. She started alternating years between Newport and New York, never keeping both houses fully staffed simultaneously. She cut the servant roster to the minimum. She delayed repairs and maintenance. She watched other Newport families give up entirely, selling their mansions for demolition, abandoning the summer colony. But Alice refused to surrender. The Breakers was Cornelius's legacy, the monument he had built to establish the family's place in American aristocracy. As long as she lived, it would remain open every summer, even if doing so consumed every dollar she had left. The tragedy was that the house itself was perfect. The fireproof construction meant nothing deteriorated. The finest materials meant nothing wore out. The Breakers could have stood for centuries unchanged, but it needed constant infusions of money to survive, and money was the one thing the Vanderbilts were running out of. The palace built to last forever would nearly die in 40 years because maintaining forever turned out to be more expensive than building it. Chapter 7, 1896, The Stroke at 53. Cornelius Vanderbilt was at his desk in New York when the stroke hit. It was 1896, just 1 year after the Breakers had been completed. He was 53 years old, in the prime of what should have been a long life managing the family's railroad empire. One moment he was reviewing documents, handling the endless details that came with controlling the New York Central and 49 related railway systems. The next moment his right side went numb and he collapsed. The doctors came immediately. In 1896, medical science had limited tools for treating strokes. They understood that something had happened in the brain, that blood flow had been disrupted, but they couldn't see inside the skull to assess the damage. All they could do was make Cornelius comfortable and wait to see how much function he would recover. The prognosis wasn't encouraging. He was partially paralyzed on his right side. His speech was affected. The relentless work ethic that had defined his adult life was suddenly and permanently broken. Alice brought him to the Breakers for recovery. The ocean air was supposed to be therapeutic, and the mansion offered space and privacy that the New York residents couldn't match. Cornelius spent his days in the oval sitting room or out on the loggia looking at the Atlantic, trying to accept what had happened. He had built the greatest private home in America and would barely enjoy it. One summer of good health in 1895. Then this. The railroad work had to continue without him. In July of 1896, Cornelius formally withdrew from active management of the New York Central. Though he retained his titles and remained involved in an advisory capacity, his brother William Kissam took over the day-to-day operations. For a man who had defined himself by duty and work, the forced retirement was almost worse than the physical disability Cornelius had spent his entire adult life being the responsible Vanderbilt, the one who managed the empire while his siblings spent freely. Now he couldn't even hold a pen properly. The tragedy was amplified by timing. His eldest son William had died of typhoid at Yale in 1892, just before the Breakers was built. Cornelius had endowed Vanderbilt Hall at Yale in his memory, trying to create some meaning from the loss. His second son, Cornelius III, had recently defied him by marrying Grace Wilson against his parents' wishes. The relationship between father and son had collapsed entirely. Cornelius was so angry about the unauthorized marriage that he had begun preparing a new will, one that would disinherit his eldest surviving son almost completely. The will was dated June 18, 1896. The same day that had originally been planned for Cornelius III's wedding before his parents forbade it. The son had gone ahead and married anyway. The father responded by ensuring his rebellious heir would receive only $500,000 outright and a $1 million trust fund, a fraction of what the other children would get. The bulk of the estate would go to the second son, Alfred Gwynne Vanderbilt, who was more obedient and hadn't challenged his father's authority. The stroke had happened shortly after these arrangements were made. Some family members later wondered if the stress of the confrontation with his son had contributed to Cornelius's collapse. The timing was certainly suspicious, but stroke risk also ran in the family. Cornelius's father, William Henry, had died suddenly of a stroke at 64. The Vanderbilt men seemed particularly vulnerable to cerebral hemorrhages, perhaps from the constant stress of managing enormous fortunes and family expectations. For 3 years, Cornelius lingered. He wasn't bedridden, but he was diminished, unable to work, Dependent on Alice and the servants for many basic tasks, he could walk with assistance. He could speak, though not clearly. He attended some social functions at the Breakers during the summers of 1897 and 1898, sitting quietly while Alice managed the hosting. But everyone could see he was a shadow of what he had been. The man who had carried the weight of the Vanderbilt empire on his shoulders could barely carry himself. September of 1899 brought the end. Cornelius had returned to New York from Newport for a railroad board meeting, one of his rare attempts to participate in business again. On the evening of September 11th, he attended the meeting at the New York Central offices. The next morning, September 12th, he woke before dawn in the family's mansion at West 57th Street. He roused Alice around 6 in the morning and reportedly told her, "I think I am dying." Minutes later, a massive cerebral hemorrhage killed him. He was 55 years old. The estate was valued at approximately $73 million, including $20 million in real estate. It was an enormous fortune, though notably, it hadn't grown during Cornelius's 14 years of management. He had maintained it, managed it responsibly, but the railroad era was ending and new sources of wealth were emerging that the Vanderbilts hadn't captured. The family's fortune had peaked. From this point forward, it would only shrink. Alice was 53 years old when Cornelius died, the same age he had been when the stroke had struck him 3 years earlier. She inherited a life interest in the Breakers and a trust fund that provided $250,000 annually, a comfortable income by any standard. But she also inherited the burden of maintaining properties that cost fortunes to run. The New York mansion consumed money endlessly. The Breakers demanded constant attention. She had children to provide for, social obligations to maintain, a position in society to uphold. For 35 years, Alice would fight to preserve what Cornelius had built. The palace he had commissioned would become her prison, a monument she couldn't afford to keep but refused to abandon. Cornelius had enjoyed the Breakers for exactly one healthy summer before his body betrayed him. Alice would struggle with it for more than 3 decades, watching as the fortune that built it slowly vanished, and the world that had celebrated it disappeared entirely. The stroke in 1896 didn't just paralyze Cornelius. It marked the beginning of the end for everything he had worked to establish. Chapter 8. Alice Alone, the 35-Year Battle. Alice Gwynn Vanderbilt became a widow at 53, nearly 54 years old. She had married Cornelius in 1867 after meeting him at Sunday school, where both taught children about Scripture and duty. 32 years of marriage ended with his death in September of 1899. She was left with the Breakers, the massive New York mansion, a comfortable trust fund, and the impossible task of maintaining both properties through a rapidly changing world. The first decade of widowhood was manageable. Alice had resources. The trust fund provided $250,000 annually, enough to cover the operating expenses of both residences with money left over. The railroad dividends still flowed to the family. Society still celebrated the Newport season every summer. Alice reopened the Breakers each June, hosted the required parties, maintained her position as one of Newport's leading figures. She became known as Alice of the Breakers, the grand dame who presided over the greatest cottage in town. But maintaining that position required constant expenditure. The summer season in Newport was competitive. Families tried to outdo each other with elaborate parties, expensive decorations, imported entertainment. Alice hosted music halls in the platinum-walled music room, formal dinners for 30 in the dining room, garden parties on the grounds. Each event required staff, food, flowers, musicians. The costs mounted quickly. Even with her substantial income, the summers consumed enormous amounts of money. The tragedy began slowly, then accelerated. In 1915, Alice's son Alfred Gwynn Vanderbilt died aboard the Lusitania. When a German submarine torpedoed the passenger liner, Alfred was 37 years old, wealthy in his own right, and by all accounts a gentleman who gave his life jacket to a woman with a baby before the ship went down. Alice buried her third child. First the daughter who died at 5 in 1874. Then William at 21 in 1892, now Alfred at 37. 10 years later, in 1925, her youngest son, Reginald Claypool Vanderbilt, died at 45. He had drunk himself to death, essentially, burning through his inheritance on parties and alcohol and bad investments. He left behind 2 young daughters, one of them little Gloria Vanderbilt, who would later become famous as a designer and mother of Anderson Cooper. Alice had now buried 4 of her 7 children. Only 3 survived: Cornelius III, who had been disinherited and rarely spoke to his mother; Gertrude, the sculptor who had married Harry Payne Whitney; and Gladys, the youngest, married to Hungarian Count Laszlo Széchenyi. After Reginald's death in 1925, Alice went into permanent mourning. She wore black for the remaining 9 years of her life. The woman who had once changed costumes 7 times a day during the social season now dressed in widow's black exclusively. The parties at the Breakers became less frequent, more subdued. Alice was 79 years old, grieving her 4th dead child, watching the world she had known disappear. The finances were deteriorating alongside her personal losses. Property taxes on the Breakers had climbed to $83,000 annually by the mid-1920s. The New York mansion carried similar burdens: insurance, maintenance, minimal staffing even in the off-season. The costs never stopped, but the income was shrinking. The Vanderbilt fortune had been divided among too many heirs. Each share was substantial, but no longer infinite. Alice found herself cutting expenses year after year, reducing staff, delaying repairs, choosing between maintaining both properties or closing one permanently. She developed a strategy of alternating years. One year she would open the Breakers for the summer and keep the New York mansion minimally staffed. The next year she would reverse the pattern, staying in New York while the Breakers sat empty except for caretakers. This way, both houses were never fully operational simultaneously, cutting the staffing costs nearly in half. It was a practical solution to an impossible problem, but it also meant she was essentially homeless half the time, moving between properties on a schedule dictated by finances rather than preference. The other Newport families were facing the same arithmetic. One by one, the great summer cottages closed. Some were sold for demolition, their materials salvaged and sold off piece by piece, marble fireplaces ripped out, elaborate woodwork stripped and auctioned. The mansions that had cost millions to build were worth more as scrap than as residences. Other families simply walked away, abandoning their palaces to decay. Windows broke. Roofs caved in. Vandalism and weather did what fortune and time had not. Alice refused to surrender. The Breakers was Cornelius's monument, the palace he had built to establish the Vanderbilt family as American royalty. As long as she lived, it would open every summer. She cut the servant staff to the absolute minimum. She stopped hosting the elaborate parties. She let some maintenance slide, accepting that certain repairs would have to wait. But every June, she returned to Newport, opened the shutters, uncovered the furniture, and presided over the Breakers for another season. The determination came at enormous personal cost. Alice spent her final years essentially broke by Vanderbilt standards, pouring every available dollar into maintaining properties she could no longer truly afford. She was trapped by her own sense of duty. Selling the Breakers would have solved the financial problems instantly, but it would also have meant admitting defeat, acknowledging that the Vanderbilt era was over. She couldn't do it, not while Cornelius's memory demanded preservation. Her relationship with her surviving children complicated everything. Cornelius III had reconciled with his father's memory, if not his mother, building his own successful career and fortune. He had no interest in the Breakers. Gertrude Vanderbilt Whitney was absorbed in her art and museum work. Having founded the Whitney Museum of American Art, she had her own properties and projects. Only Gladys, the youngest daughter, loved the Breakers the way Alice did. Gladys understood what the mansion meant, what it represented. She would be the one to inherit it, Alice decided, and with it, the burden. The decision weighed heavily. Alice knew exactly what she was doing. She was passing an impossible responsibility to her youngest child, sentencing Gladys to the same financial struggle. The same choice between maintaining the palace or letting it go. But there was no alternative. None of the other children wanted it. Selling meant demolition. The only way to preserve the breakers was to give it to someone who would fight for it the way Alice had fought. That meant Gladys. By the early 1930s, Alice was in her mid-80s, exhausted, financially strained, grieving multiple children, watching the world she had known dissolve. The Great Depression had destroyed what remained of the Vanderbilt fortune's stability. The trust fund income had collapsed. Other Newport families were abandoning their cottages entirely. Alice kept going, kept opening the breakers every summer, kept fighting to maintain what Cornelius had built. But she knew the fight was nearly over. She had bought the mansion 35 years through determination and sacrifice. Someone else would have to carry it forward from here. The question was whether anyone could. The world had changed. The income tax had made Gilded Age excess impossible. The Depression had made it obscene. Maintaining a 70-room palace on a cliff was no longer impressive. It was wasteful, tone-deaf, a relic of an era that deserved to die. Alice understood this intellectually, but emotionally she couldn't accept it. The breakers represented too much. It was Cornelius's dream made real, the monument to their marriage and family, the physical proof that the Vanderbilts had mattered. She would fight for it until her last breath. After that, the burden passed to Gladys and to fate. Chapter 9. The Depression That Nearly Killed It. October of 1929 changed everything. The stock market collapsed, wiping out fortunes overnight. Alice Vanderbilt was 83 years old, still fighting to maintain the breakers and the New York mansion on an income that had seemed adequate just months earlier. The crash destroyed that stability instantly. The trust fund that provided her annual income was invested in stocks and bonds. When the market fell, the dividends stopped coming. What had been a comfortable $250,000 a year shrank to a fraction of that amount. Alice was far from alone in her crisis. Across Newport, the other summer cottage owners faced identical arithmetic. These families had built their palaces on the assumption that fortunes were permanent, that railroad stocks and industrial investments would generate income forever. The Depression proved that assumption catastrophically wrong. The wealth that had seemed infinite in the 1890s had evaporated by the 1930s. What remained was property, beautiful and worthless, requiring constant infusions of cash that no longer existed. The response was brutal and swift. Families who had summered in Newport for decades simply stopped coming. They couldn't afford the trip, couldn't pay the staff, couldn't maintain the charade that everything was fine. One mansion after another went dark. Some were put up for sale, though there were no buyers. Who purchases a 70-room palace during the worst economic collapse in American history? A few were sold for demolition, the materials salvaged and auctioned. Marble fireplaces that cost thousands to install were ripped out and sold for hundreds. The grand staircase from one cottage was dismantled and shipped to a hotel in the Midwest. The era of Gilded Age Newport was ending in the most undignified way possible. Alice watched it happen from inside the breakers. She was too old and too stubborn to abandon ship, but she was also trapped. The mansion required a minimum level of maintenance to survive. The heating system had to run or the pipes would freeze and burst. The roof needed repairs or water would destroy the elaborate plasterwork. The grounds needed basic upkeep or the landscaping would return to wilderness. These weren't optional expenses. They were the price of preventing total collapse. She cut everything that could be cut. The servant staff was reduced to almost nothing, just a caretaker couple and minimal help during the summer season. The elaborate parties stopped entirely. The guest bedrooms on the third floor were closed off, furniture covered, heat turned off to save on coal. She stopped alternating between Newport and New York, choosing instead to spend most of her time in the smaller Manhattan townhouse she had moved to after selling the massive Fifth Avenue mansion in 1926. The breakers sat empty most of the year, a palace maintained by ghosts and memories. The property taxes remained the same regardless of her ability to pay them. $83,000 was due every year whether Alice had the money or not. The city of Newport showed no mercy and expected none. These palaces had been built by families flaunting their wealth, proving their superiority through conspicuous waste. Now that the waste had bankrupted them, Newport expected the bills to be paid regardless. Alice scraped together the payments year after year, drawing down her remaining capital, selling what she could, begging for extensions when necessary. By 1932, Alice was 86 years old and running out of options. The trust fund was essentially depleted. The remaining Vanderbilt fortune was divided among so many heirs that her share barely existed. She owned the breakers and the New York townhouse, but both required money she didn't have. The arithmetic was simple and devastating. She could maintain the properties for perhaps 2 more years at most. After that, something would have to be sold or abandoned. Other families were making that choice all around her. The Wetmore family's Chateau-sur-Mer was struggling. The Berwyn family's Elms was barely maintained marble house, built by Alice's sister-in-law Alva for $11 million, stood largely empty after Alva's death. The greatest concentration of American wealth ever assembled in one small town was dissolving, the families scattered, the fortunes gone. The cottages remained, beautiful and useless, monuments to an era that had died with surprising speed. Alice refused to quit. She understood intellectually that the battle was lost, that the Gilded Age was over, that maintaining the breakers made no economic sense, but she couldn't bring herself to surrender while she still lived. Cornelius had built this palace to establish the family's legacy. She had maintained it for 35 years out of love and duty and stubborn pride. Walking away now would mean admitting that all of it had been pointless, that the fortune was gone, that the Vanderbilt name meant nothing anymore. So she kept going. She opened the breakers for abbreviated summer seasons, just a few weeks instead of the full 8. She showed up, maintained appearances, pretended everything was fine even though everyone knew it wasn't. The Depression had leveled American society in ways that World War I had only hinted at. The distance between rich and poor had collapsed. The aristocracy that once ruled Newport was now just another group of people struggling to pay bills they couldn't afford. The irony was that the breakers itself remained perfect. The fireproof construction meant nothing deteriorated structurally. The finest materials meant nothing wore out. The platinum walls still gleamed. The marble floors remained flawless. The crystal chandeliers hung undimmed. The palace Cornelius had built to last forever was succeeding at that goal. It was the fortune required to maintain it that had proven temporary. Alice Claypool Vanderbilt died on April 22, 1934, in her Manhattan townhouse. She was 88 years old. She had outlived her husband by 35 years, buried 4 of her 7 children, watched the Vanderbilt fortune dissolve, and fought to the end to preserve the breakers. Her estate was valued at just over $10 million, which sounds substantial, until you consider her father-in-law had been worth $200 million. The fortune had shrunk by 95% in 2 generations through division, spending, and economic collapse. The breakers passed to Gladys as Alice had planned, but it passed with no money to maintain it, no income to pay the taxes, no staff to run it, no clear purpose in a world that had moved beyond Gilded Age excess. Alice had preserved the mansion for 35 years through determination and sacrifice. She had bought it 3.5 decades of survival. Now the question was whether anyone could carry it forward from here, or whether the palace would finally die from the one thing its fireproof construction couldn't prevent: bankruptcy. Chapter 10. The Daughter's Choice. Gladys Vanderbilt Szczeciny inherited the breakers in 1934. She was 47 years old, married to Hungarian Count Laszlo Szczeciny, living a comfortable life that didn't require a 70-room palace in Newport. Her mother had left her the mansion along with the impossible mathematics of keeping it. The property taxes alone were $83,000 annually. Add insurance, minimal maintenance, caretaker salaries, heating costs. The breakers required well over $100,000 a year just to survive in a dormant state. Gladys didn't have that kind of income flowing freely. Her older sister Gertrude Vanderbilt Whitney had no interest in the property. Gertrude was a successful sculptor and patron of the arts who had founded the Whitney Museum of American Art in New York. She had her own studio, her own properties, her own substantial resources from her late husband, Harry Payne Whitney. Gertrude appreciated the breakers aesthetically, but she understood it was a financial trap. Better to let Gladys handle it. Their brother Cornelius Vanderbilt III was similarly disinterested. He had been disinherited by their father decades earlier for marrying without permission, though his younger brother Alfred had reportedly given him $6 million to ease the slight. Cornelius had built his own successful career and had no desire to revisit family properties tied to painful memories. The breakers was Gladys's problem to solve. For the first 2 years, Gladys tried to maintain the traditional pattern. She opened the breakers for the summer season of 1936, staffed it minimally, occupied it briefly. The costs were staggering. Every summer season consumed capital she couldn't replace. The Depression had destroyed the investment income that previous generations relied upon. What remained of the Vanderbilt wealth was tied up in properties and trusts that generated minimal returns. Gladys was asset-rich and cash-poor, the worst possible combination when you own a mansion that eats money. From 1939 to 1942, Gladys didn't occupy the breakers at all. She and her family spent those summers at Gertrude's Newport home instead. The breakers sat empty, watched over by caretakers, slowly accumulating deferred maintenance. The grounds grew a bit wild. Some interior repairs were delayed. The structure didn't collapse thanks to its fireproof construction, but it was visibly declining. Without constant attention and resources, even the greatest palace begins to deteriorate. World War II provided temporary relief in an unexpected way. In 1942, Gladys offered the breakers to the Civilian Defense Council, and it was designated as Air Raid Shelter No. 1 for Newport. In January of 1943, over 500 air raid wardens, auxiliary workers, and volunteers conducted a major drill using the extensive basements Gladys participated in her capacity as a Red Cross volunteer. For the first time since it was built, the breakers served a purpose beyond private luxury. It was actually useful. But the war ended, and the usefulness ended with it. By 1948, Gladys faced the same question her mother had wrestled with for decades. Keep fighting to maintain a property she couldn't afford, or find some other solution. Selling was theoretically possible, but who would buy? The market for 70-room palaces was non-existent. Demolition was profitable, the materials worth more than the building itself, but that meant destroying her grandfather's legacy entirely. There had to be another option. The Preservation Society of Newport County provided that option. The organization was attempting to preserve Newport's architectural heritage, understanding that the great summer cottages were disappearing, demolished for scrap or left to decay. These buildings represented an important era in American history. The Gilded Age, when new industrial fortunes created unprecedented displays of luxury. Losing them meant losing irreplaceable examples of architecture and craftsmanship. The society approached Gladys with a proposal. Lease the breakers to them for $1 per year. They would open it to the public as a museum. Charging admission to cover operating costs, Gladys would retain ownership and could maintain a private apartment on the 3rd floor for family use. The organization would handle all maintenance, all expenses, all public tours. Gladys would be relieved of the financial burden while preserving the estate for future generations. It was an elegant solution to an impossible problem. Gladys accepted. In 1948, the breakers opened to the public. For the first time, visitors paid admission to tour the 1st and 2nd floors, walking through rooms that had been designed for private entertaining by one of America's wealthiest families. The Platinum Music Room, the Alabaster Dining Room, the Circassian Walnut Library, all became public spaces preserved exactly as they had been in the 1890s. The irony was profound. The structure built to demonstrate Vanderbilt's supremacy, to prove that one family stood above all others in wealth and taste, survived by becoming democratic. Anyone who could afford an admission ticket could now walk through rooms that Cornelius and Alice had designed for carefully selected guests. The palace that represented the ultimate in exclusivity was saved by opening its doors to everyone. Gladys lived until 1965, maintaining her third-floor apartment and watching as the Breakers became one of Rhode Island's most popular tourist attractions. She had found a way to preserve her grandfather's legacy without bankrupting herself. The estate that had nearly destroyed her mother through maintenance costs was now self-sustaining, paid for by the people who came to see it. When Gladys died, her daughter, Sylvia Sapari, inherited the property. Sylvia continued the arrangement, living on the third floor while hundreds of thousands of visitors toured the floors below. But by 1972, even this arrangement had become untenable. The building needed major restoration work. The Preservation Society wanted complete control to properly preserve and maintain it. The family was tired of being caretakers of a museum they didn't fully own. On December 28, 1972, the Preservation Society of Newport County purchased the Breakers from Gladys's heirs for $365,000. It was a fraction of what Cornelius had spent building it 77 years earlier, less than what he had paid for the original wooden cottage in 1885, but the sale included a critical stipulation. Sylvia retained the right to occupy her apartment on the third floor for the rest of her life. The Vanderbilt family could continue to summer at the Breakers, hidden away on the third floor, while strangers walked through their ancestors' former home. The arrangement continued until 1998, when Sylvia died. The organization initially allowed her children to maintain the apartment, believing it valuable to tell visitors that the original family still lived in the house. But by 2018, that relationship had soured over disputes about planned renovations and a controversial welcome center. The last family members were asked to leave for the first time since 1895. No Vanderbilt occupied the Breakers. The structure that had been built as a private palace, that had nearly bankrupted 3 generations trying to maintain it, that had survived only by surrendering ownership and becoming public, finally severed its last connection to the family that created it. The Preservation Society owned it completely. The tourists owned it collectively. The Vanderbilts, who had spent $7 million proving their supremacy, no longer had any claim to it at all. They had saved the Breakers by giving it away. In the end, that was the only option that worked. Chapter 11. The Breakers Today. Saved by Sharing. The Breakers is 130 years old. It was completed in 1895, and in 2025 it stands in essentially perfect condition. The fireproof construction that Cornelius demanded has proven its worth. The steel frame hasn't corroded. The Indiana limestone facade shows minimal weathering. The marble floors remain flawless. The platinum walls still gleam. The crystal chandeliers hang exactly where they were installed over a century ago. The palace that was built to last forever appears to be succeeding at that goal. Over 300,000 people visit the Breakers annually. They arrive in buses and cars, walking up the gravel drive that once received only invited guests. They pay admission at the gate, collect audio guides, and begin their tours through 70 rooms that were designed to overwhelm. Most visitors spend 90 minutes to 2 hours exploring the property. They photograph the Great Hall with its painted sky ceiling. They marvel at the music room's platinum walls. They study the dining room's alabaster columns and baccarat chandeliers. They walk the grounds, following paths through gardens maintained exactly as they were in the Gilded Age. The Preservation Society of Newport County operates the Breakers as a museum and its flagship property. The organization maintains 9 historic houses in Newport, but none approaches the Breakers in scale or significance. The admission revenue from this single property funds much of the Society's broader preservation work. The mansion that nearly destroyed the Vanderbilt family through maintenance costs now generates enough income to preserve other historic structures. The palace built for private luxury has become a public good. The economics are straightforward. Admission tickets cost roughly $30 per adult. With over 300,000 visitors per year, that generates approximately $9 million in gross revenue. Operating costs remain substantial. The heating system still burns through enormous amounts of fuel each winter. The grounds require year-round maintenance by professional staff. The interiors need constant attention, cleaning, conservation work. Insurance for a National Historic Landmark costs accordingly. But the numbers work. The Breakers pays for itself through tourism, the exact opposite of its original purpose. Tour guides lead groups through the first and second floors, explaining the history, the architecture, the social context. Most visitors are American, many of them older adults interested in history and preservation. They ask questions about the Vanderbilts, about the Gilded Age, about how anyone could afford to live like this. The guides explain that the families couldn't afford it in the end, that the fortunes dissolved, that every one of these Newport palaces either opened to the public or was demolished. The Breakers survived because it was given away. The third floor remains closed to tours. It was converted back to private space after the last Vanderbilt family members departed, but now it houses offices and storage rather than residence. The fourth floor, where 33 servants once lived in small rooms under the mansard roof, is similarly off-limits. The public sees the spectacular parts, the rooms designed to impress. The infrastructure that made those rooms function remains hidden, just as it was when the family occupied the house. In 1994, the Breakers was designated a National Historic Landmark, recognizing its architectural and historical significance. It represents the peak of Gilded Age excess, the moment when American industrial fortunes were translated into European-style palaces. Architectural historians study it as a perfect example of Richard Morris Hunt's work and of Beaux-Arts principles applied to domestic architecture. Social historians examine it as evidence of how the American aristocracy attempted to establish permanence through building, not understanding that wealth itself was temporary. The mansion appears in countless photographs and documentaries. It has become the visual shorthand for the Gilded Age, the single image that captures an entire era. When people imagine what life was like for America's richest families in the 1890s, they picture the Breakers, the Great Hall, the music room, the ocean view from the loggia. These spaces have become iconic, representing not just the Vanderbilt family, but an entire social class and historical moment. The irony of this fame is that it contradicts everything the Vanderbilts intended. They built the Breakers to establish their family as special, to prove their superiority over other wealthy Americans, to create a private paradise that only invited guests could experience. Instead, it has become the most public mansion in America, seen by millions, studied by scholars, photographed by tourists. The exclusivity they prized has been completely inverted. The palace is famous because everyone can see it. During the Christmas season, the Breakers receive special decoration. Fresh flowers and greenery adorn the rooms, historically accurate to how the Vanderbilts would have celebrated the chandelier's glow. The fireplaces burn. For a few weeks each year, the house comes alive in a way that approximates its original purpose, though now the guests number in the thousands rather than dozens. The holiday tours are particularly popular, often selling out weeks in advance. The Preservation Society continues investing in maintenance and restoration. In recent decades, they have undertaken major projects to repair the roof, restore original paint colors in key rooms, conserve the elaborate plasterwork. Each project costs hundreds of thousands of dollars, sometimes millions. But the work is necessary. The Breakers generates enough revenue to justify these investments. It remains the crown jewel of the organization's properties, the single most important historic house museum in Rhode Island. The mansion has outlived everyone who built it, everyone who tried to maintain it, everyone who fought over what to do with it. Cornelius died in 1899, enjoying it for barely a year. Alice struggled with it for 35 years before dying in 1934. Gladys handed it to the Preservation Society in 1948. The last family residence left in 2018. The house persists, unchanging, while generations come and go. The lesson of the Breakers is both simple and profound. Beauty and craftsmanship can endure, but only if they serve a purpose beyond private luxury. The palace survived by becoming public, by opening its doors to anyone interested in history and architecture. The Vanderbilts couldn't save it by keeping it exclusive. The Preservation Society saved it by making it democratic. 300,000 visitors per year provide the resources that $70 million in Vanderbilt fortune could not. The mansion stands on its cliff overlooking the Atlantic, exactly as Cornelius Vanderbilt intended 130 years ago. The waves still break on the rocks below. The limestone facade still gleams in the sunlight. The Great Hall still soars 50 feet high to its painted sky. Everything is preserved perfectly, but the meaning has changed completely. The palace built to prove Vanderbilt's supremacy now proves something else entirely. It proves that sharing saves what hoarding destroys. It proves that public interest preserves what private wealth abandons. It proves that the best way to make something last forever is to give it to everyone. The Breakers endures not despite losing its exclusivity, but because of it. That wasn't what the Vanderbilts intended. But it's what saved their palace from the demolition that claimed so many others, and it's what ensures the Breakers will stand for another century, welcoming visitors who come to see what American aristocracy looked like at its peak, and what happened when that aristocracy discovered that even $7 million couldn't buy forever.